Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Institute of Irish Studies seminar, based here in Queen's University, Belfast. It's a great pleasure to have so many of you with us this afternoon, which we're running the series this semester through Microsoft Teams. Hopefully we'll get through without any major technical problems. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the setup, if I could ask you to mute your microphones when you join the meeting. I'll introduce our speaker in just a minute, and then he'll give his presentation. I hope you can see his slides already on the screen. Perhaps if you can't, you could let me know through the chat. And once Padraig's given his presentation, then we'll move straight on to Q&A. And at that point, I'll ask you just to indicate that you want to ask a question by pressing the little hand icon that you should see on your screen. That will flag up that you want to ask a question. I'll then invite you to speak. So unmute yourselves at that point, and then Padraig will respond. Okay, so without further ado, then our speaker this afternoon, I'm delighted to be able to introduce him to you. He's very familiar with Queen's. Pádraig McGonagle holds a number of degrees from Queen's: BA, MA, PGCE, and PhD, which he completed a couple of years ago with the Irish department here at the School of what was School of Modern Languages, now Arts, English, and Languages. He's from Derry City. He was awarded, once he'd completed his PhD, a Fulbright scholarship to teach Irish in the United States in 2018-2019. And he's been working more recently at the Culturlan Econon in Derry, where he's working currently. So Pádraig did his PhD on Éamon de Valera and Irish language policy in the 1930s, 1940s, and afterwards. And that's what he's going to speak to us about this afternoon on the topic of Éamon de Valera and the state's revival of Irish, the devolution of responsibility. So, Pádraig, over to you.
Good, Peter. I hope you can hear me okay. If you could just confirm first. Peter, thanks.
I can hear you, no problems.
Yeah, and okay, I'll carry on. So thanks very much for the introduction, Peter. It's nearly a year ago since Margaret O'Callaghan emailed me inviting me to the Institute to give a paper such as this, and between one thing and another over the past year, we're only getting to it now, but as you said there, I spent the guts of 10 years at Queen's and have a strong affiliation with the university and with the Irish department and yourself. So thanks, Margaret and Peter, for inviting me back to do this. It's really nice to be asked back. A quick hello also to Marcus McKinney and Fergal McGarry, my two PhD supervisors, and to Michal O'Manion and Regina Collatine, who you had on giving a paper earlier in the series here recently, who both examined my PhD and were very helpful with feedback and observations. So that's the hellos and the thanks. And now to get into the topic. As you mentioned, I conducted research and wrote my PhD on Éamon de Valera, the Irish language and linguistic nationalism was the title. So I'll be focusing in on one particular aspect of that today, and that is responsibility for the revival of Irish. Who is responsible, who was responsible, and the transition that you'll see today from the state 100 years ago, or the soon-to-be state, the new Irish Free State as it was, and initially that state's acceptance of responsibility, and then how it changed over time. So I'd like to say why I'm talking about this today. First and foremost, it gives us a greater understanding of 20th century Ireland, of course, and understanding Éamon de Valera, a key figure over the past century. whenever we think about the Gaelic revival and the revolutionary generation, if we go back 100 years to 1920 and 1919, the creation of the first Dáil, and eventually, shortly afterwards, the establishment of the Irish Free State, many members, or the majority of that revolutionary generation, would have viewed the state as, or this new Irish state, as having responsibility to revive Irish. They had done their work in terms of a voluntary effort and getting the movement going through the Gaelic revival, but they would have viewed the revival then as falling under the remit of a new Irish Gaelic state, if you like. Historians identify the 1960s and the 1970s as the period where we see a change for the first time in state policies towards the revival. So once the state was established and introduced a number of policies to promote and preserve the Irish language in the 1920s, that really formed the basis of language policies for the next 40 years. They weren't really altered significantly until the 1960s, but as you'll see here today, there were more subtle changes over those 40 years from the 1920s until the 1960s, and specifically what I'll be talking about, this transition from the state having responsibility to revive the language to more of an onus being on the public to revive the language. You'll see it, I think McGill Christ puts it most accurately. The changes in the 60s and 70s represented the deinstitutionalization of the Irish language from the nation state. So at times it may not have been, or at times it may have been vague, or it may not have been particularly clear, but the policies, as the public understood them from the 1920s until the 60s, were the policies were in place with the goal of bringing about a full revival of the Irish language, so restoring Irish as the predominant language in Ireland amongst the majority of the population. In the 60s and 70s, historians would talk about that period now as a weakening of those policies and a move towards, you see there, a benevolent bilingualism, as Whitaker put it. Thinking about the modern day context, and the relevance of this paper and this topic to that, I would like you to bear in mind, as I talk about this, the current language context in the North, and the need for a standalone Irish Language Act, and hopefully this discussion, and maybe it will come up in the Q&A at the end, raises some issues about the state's role and the public's role, and really, we understand today that you need to have both things for a successful revival. But as I say, and as I'll show here, in the 1920s, people were very much of the opinion that it was the state's role to revive Irish. Usually, whenever I mention Éamon de Valera to people, Michael Collins is mentioned within a few seconds by someone else. So depending on how much you know about him, it's worth making the point that Éamon de Valera had a very long and interesting life and career. People may be less familiar with the impact he had upon the Irish language, and you'll see here in this slide that he wore many different hats throughout his career and throughout his life. He was a soldier and a political leader and Chancellor of the National University of Ireland, amongst many other roles and titles he held. You'll see on this slide, so that you don't have to take my word for it, quotes from a number of historians testifying or clarifying that Éamon de Valera had a sincere interest in the Irish language, and this is a word that comes up again and again. So regardless of his policies or the success of his the governments that he was head of, their success in reviving Irish, on a personal level, accepted that he had a very sincere interest in the language. Just to give you a bit of brief background on De Valera's own language journey. He didn't learn the language, he didn't learn Irish in childhood. He began learning Irish as an adult whenever he was 25 years old and living in Dublin. He started attending classes run by the Gaelic League, and as many people who have learned Irish will understand, he fell in love with his first teacher, Sinead Ní Lanigan, and they were married a year or two later, shortly afterwards. So this period from 1908 until 1913, De Valera, between one thing and another, attending classes and marrying his teacher a year or two later, he really threw himself into the revival and to the whole Irish language community in Dublin and beyond. He competed for prizes at Oireachtas na Gaeilge in 1910 and 1911. Unfortunately, not for singing or dancing. He competed in teaching categories, but nevertheless, it shows his strong interest, personal and professional, in the language by this stage. He ran and was director or principal of a Gaeltacht college that ran in the summer for students to go to Talwyn in Galway and learn Irish. And then just the final point there, you'll see that he maintained honorary positions and personal affiliations with the Gaelic League and with the Ardcreeve of the Gaelic League, the central branch, for the rest of his life and career. This is a nice photograph of De Valera from his period in Talwyn. So he would have been about 29, 30 years old here, and he looks a bit like an awkward student weighing up whether he's going to get into that boat or not. But it's a nice photo from his younger days, whenever he was getting really involved with the language movement. Looking forward towards his political career then, and this covers the period that many people would be more familiar with De Valera and his achievements from the 1920s until the 1950s. These are his major achievements in relation to the Irish language over that period. First and foremost, whenever he and Fianna Fáil came to power in 1932, they extended many of the language policies, especially in the education sector and in the civil service and in other areas of government. It's worth making the point, or it's worth noting, that Éamon de Valera or Fianna Fáil didn't introduce these policies. A lot of the policies that people would think of today whenever they think back to the state accepting responsibility for the revival of Irish and introducing. These were introduced by Comhdháil and W.T. Cosgrave, and De Valera as leader of government then built on and extended many of these policies. He established the Irish Folklore Commission in 1935. He experimented with a land redistribution scheme by giving land to Irish speakers from parts of Connemara in County Meath and resettling them there to try and establish, even the government talked about, they used the word colonies, Irish-speaking colonies in the east of Ireland at the time. So with some successes and some failures regarding that policy. Of course, 1937 saw Bunreacht na hÉireann, the Irish Constitution, enacted, which clarified and really enhanced the legal status of Irish within the state. De Valera established the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies in 1940, of which the School of Celtic Studies is a key part, and he exerted significant impact upon the standardization of written Irish in terms of the grammar and the spelling over the 1940s and 1950s. De Valera, of course, over a long career, delivered many speeches, and he spoke a lot about the Irish language throughout his career. These are the three main themes of those speeches. or from whenever he was speaking about language. Firstly, he defined Irish as the defining characteristic of Irish. He described Irish as the defining characteristic of Irish nationality, clarifying repeatedly that it was more important than being born in Ireland or being Catholic or having a certain political stance. If you spoke Irish, this meant you were Irish, and you could become Irish by speaking Irish. Secondly, he repeatedly made the point that the revival of Irish was more important than ending partition. He spoke about this before partition was enacted, and then he maintained this stance throughout his career. He viewed partition as inevitably doomed to failure, whereas he recognized that there was urgency with the revival, and he worried about Irish dying out or going extinct as a language, and then he felt that it would be impossible to bring it back. So the first 2 points there are very prevalent in De Valera's speeches from throughout his career. But the third point regarding the transfer or the devolution of responsibility from the state towards the public really only emerged towards the late 1930s, and that's what I will be talking about today. You'll see a photo here, a nice photo of many of the key members of Conradh na Gaeilge, or the Gaelic League, in 1913, and you might recognise a few of those highlighted: Padraig, Gaeilge, Éamon McGonagle. I show this photograph to make the point that, again, that this generation, whether we refer to them as the Gaelic League generation or the revolutionary generation, they viewed it as whenever they achieved their own state or established their own Irish state, one of the key functions of that state was to revive the Irish language. I might refer to Conradh na Gaeilge or the Gaelic League using the Irish or the English terms over the next 20 minutes or so as well, so I'll try to remain consistent. They were primarily known as Conradh na Gaeilge in the early 20th century, or as the Gaelic League, and today we would be more used to them as Conradh na Gaeilge. Anyhow, you'll see here a number of points regarding the state's responsibility for the state accepting responsibility for reviving Irish in the 1920s. The first Dáil in 1919, under Éamon de Valera, even established a ministry for Irish. It was relatively short-lived, as it was actually De Valera then in 1921 who replaced the Ministry for Irish with the Ministry for Education, and in doing so linked the perception that Irish and education were going to be one and the same for this new state. And the education system certainly became the main way in which the state attempted to revive the language and support the language and teach people Irish and lead the revival. You'll see here the Article 4 from the Free State's new constitution in 1922, stating that the national language of the state is the Irish language and also equally recognises English. A number of measures, as I mentioned, were introduced by Comhdháil and W.T. Cosgrave throughout the 1920s, particularly in education, which, as I said, was to become the way in which the state would lead the revival through the education sector. There was a particularly ambitious programme in place between 1922 and 1926 that stated that all education at infant level, so in the first couple of years of national school, had to be entirely Irish medium, and beyond that, every other class in the national schools had to be taught through Irish for at least 1 hour per day. It was wheeled back a bit in 1926 because it was coming under criticism from teachers primarily, but nevertheless, more policies continued to be put in place and developed For example, a pass in Irish was made a compulsory element or requirement in order to successfully pass the intermediate certificate from 1928, and there were a variety of other incentives introduced. Similar measures were put in place throughout the civil service. So you saw a pass in Irish becoming a requirement for different levels and different grades. And in 1926, the government commissioned a report into the Gaeltacht. It's known as the Gaeltacht Commission Report, which was established to officially map out and draw the boundaries of the Gaeltacht Irish-speaking areas, and to make recommendations for how the economic conditions could be improved in those areas for the people living there. Beyond the state's own policies, further evidence for the state accepting responsibility and in turn the public relinquishing responsibility for leading the revival of Irish can be seen in the decline of the Gaelic League throughout the 1920s. It had a very high membership and a very high number of active branches. Towards the end of the revolutionary period, we see it had 565 branches at that time, and this declined rapidly to just 139 branches by 1924, which was one of the low points compared to number of active branches over the previous decade or so. This in part was due to the tensions and the splits caused by the Irish Civil War. So the Gaelic League experienced that as much as any other organisation, but it's also evidence that the public felt, okay, now we've established a state and the state can take over responsibility for reviving Irish. By the late 1920s, de Valera, amongst others, was calling on the state to do even more to revive Irish, to accept even more responsibility. He pointed out in 1927 that it was in the government's power to give a helping hand to the restoration of the language and to preserve the Gaeltacht, and it was really their duty to do so. In 1928, in the Dáil, he called for the government to establish a ministry for the Gaeltacht, and said if they weren't going to do this, they should at least give direct control for all aspects of government relating to the Gaeltacht, the Irish-speaking areas. They should give them to the head of government. So that was the president of the Executive Council, as it was known at the time. So as leader of the opposition, de Valera was telling the government, you need to set up a ministry or appoint a secretary for the Gaeltacht, or create some sort of similar institution. He continued this, and we see another this vein in his speeches, and we see another example here from the 1930 Fianna Fáil Ardèche, where he informed delegates that people will know if political parties are sincere or not whenever it comes to the language based on their actions, and people will be able to see how sincere Fianna Fáil is about the language based on their actions whenever they come to power. In 1932, as I mentioned before, de Valera and Fianna Fáil came to power and formed their first government, and this was welcomed widely by Irish speakers. Fáinne Lay described it as the end of the big storm that had been raging for the past 10 years with Cumann na nGaedheal in power, and Cleve Solis described it as the beginning of a new era for the Gael, or for Irish speakers, an era in which fairness and equality lay in store. For the first year or two in power, the signs seemed positive. In 1933, de Valera introduced, or the government introduced a £2 Jointus or grant scheme, which saw £2 getting paid to families in the Gaeltacht for every child they had between 6 and 12 years old that they could prove was living in an Irish-speaking environment at home. And that was to be paid on an annual basis. The 1934 revised programme of primary instruction saw the government basically going back to the ambitious educational policy that had operated between 1922 and 1926. So it went back to that. They built on what Comhdháil had started by introducing the requirement that students passed Irish in order to get the intermediate certificate in 1928. Fianna Fáil extended this to the leaving certificate in 1934. And beyond these examples from the education sector, it was similar in other areas of government. But as I said, education was quickly becoming inextricably linked with the revival, and it was clear that it was how all parties viewed they were going to revive Irish most effectively through the education system. As we know, and as I mentioned before then, Pádraig McGonagle in 1937 really enhanced the status of Irish legally by clarifying that the Irish version of the Constitution, if there, in the case of any discrepancies between the Irish and English versions, that the Irish version of the 1937 document would take precedence. After a year or two, however, 1933, 1934, Irish speakers started looking around themselves and looking at each other and having discussions, pointing out that Fianna Fáil didn't seem that different from Comhdháil. There was no radical changes. There was no radical new direction. There was a gradual and systematic extension and evidence of building on the policies that had been introduced by the 1920s, but it wasn't the radical change that many Irish speakers were hoping for. So since the League, the Gaelic League, had declined through the 1920s, in the early 1930s then you see, after Fianna Fáil came to power in 1933 and 1934, you see a number of new Irish language organisations breaking away from the Gaelic League. And most of these organisations listed here shared a socialist agenda. Essentially, they tended to be younger people, and they focused on the need for economic development of the Gaeltacht, and they focused on youth schemes, whether that be for a national school level or secondary level or universities. Nevertheless, by 1937, you see here Article 8 from Pádraig McGonagle quoted, which clarified that the Irish language as the national language is the first official language. And while the 1922 Constitution had equally recognised English as another official language, you see here clearly there's more of a clear effort to put Irish in the first place as the national language and first official language. English was relegated slightly to a second official language. Overall, from 1922 until 1937, we see a gradual development of policies, and we see Fianna Fáil coming into power and continuing the same trajectory that Comhdháil had started. Now, with the new constitution, it seemed that we were about to enter a new era of the revival, and we'll see now what shape that took. At the 1936 Fianna Fáil Ardèche, de Valera for the first time spoke about that the government can't do everything to revive Irish, and that the public would have to start accepting more responsibility to do so. It's interesting that he shared this development in his thinking with his own party first before he shared it more publicly. He may have been testing out the idea, because we see in 1937 then a similar subtle development in that it's up to the people to realise what the restoration of the language means for our nationality. And he listed the groups that the revival was now dependent upon. He mentioned schools, grown-up people, so the public, and other organisations in Irish life. It's interesting more what he didn't say, in that he didn't mention the government or the state as one of the groups that the revival of Irish depended upon. These were subtle enough developments shared with Fianna Fáil. And we see in 1938, whenever he was speaking at an event at Athbheochan, which was kind of a precursor to, it was Feish, obviously, in Dublin, that was going really well over the late 1930s, and it was a significant influence in helping to re-establish Oireachtas na Gaeilge in 1939. In any case, De Valera was speaking at one of these events at the Feish, and he spoke in Irish, and you'll see a translation below. He pointed out that the revival of Irish was not only the work of the government, and that it also depended upon every single citizen. This, of course, makes sense. We understand today, as I mentioned at the beginning, that in order to revive a language, we really need state support, and of course, you need the public support, and this has to be agreed upon by both parties and be developed over time. But it's really from the late 1930s now we see De Valera talking about increased individual responsibility and public responsibility for the language. And he was relinquishing some of the responsibility that the state had. Whenever we look, it's very clear from his speeches from the late 1930s until the end of his career. And it's the absence of that theme is really clear whenever we look at his speeches prior to the late 1930s. So it's a clear development. On the 29th of December 1938, he delivered a significant radio broadcast reflecting on one year since the new constitution, since Bonrach na hÉireann had been enacted. You see that he spoke about language in Irish in this speech, and you'll see a translation of what he said here now on the screen, pointing out that the revival of Irish was not just the work of the government. It depends on every one of us, and indeed, individual responsibility is in some ways even greater than the government's responsibility. He used the analogy of planting a seed and seeing if it will yield any results. But you can see clearly he's increasingly emphasizing this individual responsibility or public responsibility for reviving the Irish language. I'll share a few more examples with you here from the next decade or so, following on from the 1930s, and you'll see the same theme and a lot of the same language in being employed again and again. In 1939, De Valera talked about people looking too much to the government to solve their problems, and parishes and individuals should really get on with the work themselves. In 1943, in the Ireland that we dreamed of speech on St. Patrick's Day that many of you will be familiar with, in relation to language, he made it very clear that it's up to the individual citizen ultimately to learn Irish and to speak it. Moving on a bit towards the late 1940s, then he pointed out that it depends on people to revive Irish, and the government can't do it by waving a wand. And then I think the second statement here in particular is really significant, and it stands out to me because he pointed out that government support for the Irish language can only be auxiliary aids. You can bring a horse to the water, but you can't make it drink. I'd imagine if we could go back to the photo of Conradh na Gaeilge or the Gaelic League in 1913 and tell them that a new state would be created within the next 10 years from when that photograph was taken. But by 1949, it would be talking, or although De Valera was leader of the opposition in 1949, he had just spent 16 years as head of government, and he would be describing government or state support for the Irish language as limited to auxiliary aids as opposed to leading the revival. I think a lot of people in that photograph would be very disappointed. So we've looked at a few statements there from the late 1930s on, taking us up to 1949, but I'd like to go back to 1938, then the year after the new constitution was enacted, and this period where we seem to be about to enter a new phase of the revival. And I'd like to look at what did De Valera suggest, what actions did he suggest taking then, rather than simply encouraging the public to take more responsibility for reviving Irish. When we come to this idea, you'll see in the title there, Bart le Bríothar, which is a well-known phrase in Irish, and means action with word. So your actions matching your words, essentially. Towards the end of 1938, we see De Valera proposing to establish a new organisation for young people to lead the revival. So this is in keeping with his encouragement for the public to accept more responsibility for the revival. Similar to how he seemed to test out the idea with Fianna Fáil delegates in 1936 and 1937 regarding public responsibility. It was again at the Fianna Fáil Ardèche in November 1938 that De Valera mentioned this idea of establishing a new organisation for the first time. He mentioned that he was thinking about and planning on establishing a new organisation, for a new Irish language organisation for people aged between 17 and 25. He developed the idea and described this more through a number of public and private meetings and writings over the next couple of months. So a brief summary of the scheme was as follows. He wanted to divide the public up into these groups, 15 to 17-year-olds, 17 to 30-year-olds, and you'll all be happy to know he described the third group as the old people, the over 30s. And he identified this middle group, the 17 to 30-year-olds, so young adults. He identified this group as the group that was most essential to the revival of Irish. And never mind Make America Great Again, he pointed out that this group, the young adults, would make Ireland Gaelic again by running social events and classes through Irish language classes throughout the country. It would start in Dublin, where it would be established, and it would naturally spread throughout the country. He was really taken by this idea, and you can, in some of the meetings from the minutes from the meetings where he talked about this idea and described it to others, you can sense his passion, but maybe also a bit of naivety in how simplistic or innocent he was, and that he seemed to think that all you had to do was establish this organisation and it would just spread like wildfire throughout the country, ignoring the fact that really it didn't seem particularly innovative. The description of it, whenever you look at some of the minutes that describe it, really it had a lot of similarities with Conradh na Gaeilge or the Gaelic League and how it had operated at the beginning of the 20th century. So you're going back to the 1890s and the 1900s, 40 or 50 years earlier, and hoping that the public would get behind it and that it would spread naturally and lead the revival of Irish. I mentioned there that he held a number of meetings where he described his plans for this organisation further with others. In November and December 1938, De Valera invited a number of Irish language organisations and representatives or delegates from these organisations to come and meet with him so that he could share with them his idea for a new youth organisation. The response was lukewarm. Some thought it was an okay idea, but really each of these organizations presented De Valera with their own demands in these meetings, because of course that's what they were interested in doing at the first chance they got. And what we see, especially whenever we look at these different meetings collectively, we see that the Irish language lobby, or these different Irish language groups, were at this stage already. So from the late 1930s, they were calling for the government, similar to how De Valera had called for it in the late 1920s. They were calling for the government to establish an independent board for the Gaeltacht, or a ministry for Irish, or an independent national council, or something similar, some type of independent board or ministry for either the Gaeltacht or for the Irish language. And these ideas kind of got mixed. But it was clear that they wanted more significant action, and they weren't thinking about a new youth organisation. I've mentioned there Chimmery in between brackets. Some of you will recognise the concept. Chimmery, or organisers, as they'd often be called in English, were the title of many people who were carrying out the work for the Gaelic League in the beginning of the 20th century. So cycling around the country, often on bikes, and running Irish language classes and establishing branches. So there was some support for this idea that was quite similar in a way to De Valera's new youth organisation. There was some support for that amongst the groups. So I don't want to portray De Valera as looking back at the early 20th century methods and the Irish language lobby as being extremely innovative, or just solely looking for this board and a new ministry. There was some support for that, but primarily they did focus on the need for a new board or ministry, and De Valera ignored them. More so than ignoring them, in March 1939, when De Valera was speaking to the Civil Service Gaelic Society, he informed them that in March 1939, when speaking to the Civil Service Gaelic Society, De Valera informed the society that whenever he had met the Gaelic League in December 1939, they fully supported his idea for a new organisation. Quickly, and in the next day or two, the members of the League delegation who had been present at that meeting took to the press and criticised De Valera's plans for a new organisation, and they pointed out that they never had supported the idea. Nevertheless, De Valera remained committed to this new organisation, or this idea of establishing it, throughout the rest of the year. And when the GAA and the Gaelic League approached the government for funding to establish new youth schemes to encourage young people to speak Irish over towards the end of 1939, De Valera, or the government, turned them down, but De Valera reassured them that there was a new organisation about to be established that would encourage young people to speak Irish, and they didn't need to worry. But the emergency intervened, and the new organisation, the youth organisation that De Valera had in mind, was never established. Throughout the early 1940s, we see a number of new Irish language organisations and publications that were established. It would be most accurate to view this development, or this diversification in the Irish language lobby, or the amongst Irish language speakers. It's more accurate to view this development as a response to the stagnation of the government, or of the state's policies and successive governments' policies in the 20 years since the state had been established, rather than them answering De Valera's metaphorical call to arms for the public to accept more responsibility for reviving Irish. Nevertheless, the government did establish a new organisation in 1943 called Comhdháil nationality na Gaeilge. It bore some similarities to De Valera's youth organisation from 1938 that he had talked about, but it was clearly a different concept at the same time. It was established as an organisation that would coordinate the work of all the other Irish language organisations and would kind of be a central body and maybe in a way a buffer between the government and the increasingly diverse Irish language lobby. Martin O'Kane, who many of you will be familiar with, described it as Rudcho Chaibrecha Shin Gagaiche Gumach Refugiact as Ceann de Valera Hainavian, something so disheveled that it had to be inspired or come from De Valera's own head. So he wasn't a big fan. And soon enough, De Valera wasn't a big fan either, even though he and his government established this organisation. Despite the reason or the purpose for which it had been set up to coordinate the lobby and the work of different Irish language organisations, very quickly, the Comhdháil nationality na Gaeilge, it effectively became just another Irish language group or another Irish language organisation that was petitioning the government and calling for the government and the state to create a ministry for Irish and a board for the Gaeltacht. It was taken over by younger socialist elements or students really in 1946. For the first few years, it was controlled by overlapping figures from the Gaelic League who controlled it in the first few years, but it was taken over in 1946 and became more and more vocal in calling for the government to establish an independent commissioner and board for the Gaeltacht. And in 1947, significantly, given what we're talking about here, this idea of the state transferring responsibility to the public for the revival, in 1947, Comhdháil published a memorandum with recommendations for how the state could lead the revival of Irish. And this memorandum pointed out that there was widespread public support for the revival of Irish, but the public didn't have the means, they didn't have the institutions to lead a national revival of Irish. That responsibility very much stayed with the state. Throughout the late 1940s and the 1950s, De Valera had different relationships or changeable relationships with Comhdháil and with the Gaelic League. He often played them against one another, and they were frequently at loggerheads with each other. And usually, whenever De Valera was getting on well with one, Comhdháil or the League, he had fallen out with the other. But despite their differences, Comhdháil and the League, the Gaelic League, Conradh na Gaeilge, continued to call on successive governments, the first inter-party government as well, whenever De Valera was in opposition. They called on the state to establish a ministry for Irish or a board for the Gaeltacht or a ministry for the Gaeltacht. Some type of new state-led measure and clear commitment that the state was going to lead the revival and continue leading the revival of Irish. Repeatedly, De Valera, throughout the early 1950s, told successive delegations from Conradh na Gaeilge and from Comhdháil that the state was unable to establish a ministry for Irish or a ministry for the Gaeltacht or a board for the Gaeltacht. And interestingly, these are his 4 reasons why he said it was just simply impossible to do so. He said there wouldn't be enough, it would be impossible to get qualified candidates to become minister, which just doesn't stand up at all. There were already several Irish-speaking ministers throughout the decades under various governments and various parties. Most interestingly, and perhaps this is the one where the real reason lies, he worried that a minister for the Gaeltacht would become too powerful because, and he pointed out and he explained that this idea of having a board or a ministry for the Gaeltacht, he was worried that then a new minister would have to be responsible solely for education and for the Gardaí and for other state institutions within the Gaeltacht, and in a sense could use this as a power base to challenge the government or the state. So you have to think here that De Valera was worried about challenges to his own power coming from within his cabinet. He was also worried that everything to do with Irish would be left to the new department. And again, this doesn't stand up because without a new department or for Irish or for the Gaeltacht, everything was already being left to the Department of Education. And that had been the case for a number of decades since the state had really tied the revival so closely to the education sector. And he also said that the state simply couldn't afford a new ministry. But all of these reasons were soon proven to be immaterial because in 1956, the second inter-party government established the Department for the Gaeltacht, Rin na Gaeltachta, whenever De Valera was in opposition and he was leader. So he was out of government, and this new department was established, and it didn't create any major problems. It didn't bankrupt the state or anything like that. In 1958, quickly getting to the end here, one of De Valera's last significant achievements in relation to the language while head of government before he became president in 1959, so still head of government in 1958, he established Comisiún Athbheochan the Gaeilge, the Commission for the Restoration of the Irish Language, to investigate what the state of affairs as they were, essentially, what state the language was in the country, and what steps and measures needed to be taken for the next stage of the revival. He pointed out, this first point here is a quote from the first meeting of the commission where he pointed out, he spoke in Irish, and my translation is underneath. He pointed out again that it's a personal responsibility, so maybe attempting to get his own personal view across to the commission before it undertook its work. Nevertheless, the commission carried out its work over a few years and made clear with its report in 1964 through 288 recommendations all of the improvements that the state could do and measures that it could implement and take to lead the revival of Irish. The government response, bearing in mind that De Valera was president by 1965, but Fianna Fáil were in power, and the government, echoing De Valera's statements for the past couple of decades, made the point clear that it's not up to the government alone to revive Irish, and we also need a sustained personal effort from the public. Getting back to where we started then, I mentioned that the 1960s and 70s saw a number of change in policies, and this would often be recognised and described by historians as a weakening or a watering down of the revivalist policies that were introduced in the 1920s. Then whenever Fine Gael and Labour formed a coalition government in 1973, they removed the need to pass an exam in Irish in order to be awarded the junior or leaving certificates, and they removed the requirement for compulsory knowledge of Irish for applicants to the civil service. So you see here again, I've just highlighted where we started with this period of the 60s and 70s, where we see a change in government policy for the first time regarding the revival, moving from a policy where the state appeared to be pursuing full revival and really committed, at least they said they were committed as a state to reviving the Irish language as the predominant language in Ireland. This was replaced with more of a policy of bilingualism in the 60s and 70s, and that remains the case today. But as I hope you've learned here over the past half hour or so, there was this subtle development in De Valera's speeches in particular, and we've seen his attempts to establish an Irish language youth organisation, which might have perhaps led a new era, or really made clear that there was a new era of the language revival from the 1940s. But the organisation wasn't set up, and there was real lack of clarity that I believe we had progressed into this new era where the state had relinquished some of its responsibility and was passing that on to the public without fully making clear to the public that that was the case. So the youth organisation represented an attempt to provide an institutional framework through which the public could accept more responsibility for reviving Irish. But once De Valera failed to get the organisation established through a lack of support for it, and in all likelihood with the emergency and World War II also occupying a lot of his time, De Valera essentially doubled down. So while his speeches reiterated the need for the public to accept more responsibility to revive Irish, there was no clear change in policies until the 1960s and the 70s. You could argue that there was no need for De Valera to change his policies or for his party. They were performing well in a political sense in terms of being re-elected. The policies that they had seemed popular. And he was probably worried that if he changed the policies, especially regarding the revival, that this would be viewed as the policies up until that point, or even the revival itself, had failed. But as I said, this led to lack of clarity regarding responsibility for the revival of Irish from the 1940s. If you were to ask people, the general population in Ireland in the 1950s, who was responsible for reviving Irish, I'm sure they would still tell you that it was the state was leading the revival. But whenever we examine closely this development in De Valera's speeches, and then whenever we look at the lack of the change in policies, I think we can see that the state was increasingly placing, really subtly, but increasingly placing responsibility on the public. De Valera called on the public to do more, but then he ignored the fact that the likes of Comhdháil, Náisiúnta, Gaeilge, Gaeilge, and other organisations were the Irish-speaking public who had came together and were organising themselves and were submitting recommendations and demands to the government and to the state in order to revive Irish more effectively. They represented the Irish-speaking public, but De Valera never seems to have fully understood that and looked at them more as organisations rather than organisations representative of the public. And finally, then, just to bring us back to the modern day, as I said, thinking about, I hope you will go away from this thinking a bit about the current climate and the modern day context, and recognising that it's not up to the state to revive a language. Of course, there's a huge public responsibility to do so, and beyond an Irish context as well. But that both parties need to buy into it, really, and in the first place need to establish what the goals are and be really clear on that, and have measurable targets and shared responsibility. And I'll finish it there, and I'll welcome any questions. Padraig.
Padraig, thank you very much for that extremely clear and effective presentation. That was great. I'm sure that will stimulate a lot of questions. So just a reminder to people, if you'd like to pose a question, just raise your hand digitally and I'll invite you then to speak. So let's start with Paul.
Thank you very much for that and all that detail and the various approaches. I'd only have been familiar with the more modern end of things. But it has seemed to me that from at the late 19th century, that the language was beyond repair. and that these were all things that were sort of ticking boxes and aspirational stuff, but that there was never really any prospect of the language becoming in any way the predominant language, or even an equal bilingual situation. And that would be my feeling, and that to me explains really why all of this doesn't work. The base had become too low. We had lived our history for the last 100 and whatever, nearly 200 years through the medium of English, and it just was undoable. Would you go along with that?
I suppose I wouldn't, because I understand your point, and there's a lot of people who would agree with you, definitely. I think personally I couldn't possibly agree with that, because having grown up in an English-speaking environment myself, and then learned Irish through school, and then I'm lucky and happy enough to have had the opportunities to study Irish and teach Irish abroad, and now I work in the Irish language sector, or lucky enough, if I could call it the Irish language world. So I have a lot of opportunities, and it's interesting even to think about the revival. I think we're too quick to say the revival failed, or because it didn't we didn't achieve this goal of that many of the people in the early 20th century would have had, as I mentioned there, and restoring Irish as the predominant language in the state or in the country or anything like that. But there obviously was even the preservation of the Irish language. I'm sure, as you mentioned, the late 19th century, if you were to go back and try to explain to some people then about even the current situation of the Irish language within Ireland today, I think they'd be surprised. And the fact that Irish still exists and flourishes in certain limited contexts presents hope and presents continuation. And that the point De Valera made was that if this thing dies out, or if we let this die, we can never get it back. And even then, I don't want to get away from an Irish context, but if you look at Israel or other contexts about there are examples around the world of restoring languages effectively. But I suppose I accept your point, but I don't agree.
Paul, do you want to come back?
Yeah, I just want to come back quickly. And first of all, the point I was making really was that the capacity or the possibility really wasn't there from way back. But you mentioned Israel. I remember the brothers in school gave us that as well. But Israel is a very specific point, and the real thing is motivation. I mean, De Valera was trying to put it over to the people, fine. But if the people are not motivated, it's not going to work. And they won't be motivated unless there is some advantage in speaking it, that it gives them access to something they wouldn't have had access to. Now, in the case of Israel, the Hebrew thing is often quoted as indicating that it's possible to restore a dead or a very redundant or very minor language. But the point in Israel is that Israel had people coming from all over the world, and they had a total Tower of Babel of languages there. They needed a common language, and Hebrew was able to provide that. So there was a motivation there for a common language. I don't see, I mean, I like yourself only got Irish in school, that came up through Coláiste Dhuire, and have some still contact with it. But it seems to me that basically the motivation isn't there. And if you look at even the people who are learning Irish, and I am listening to stuff on the radio, what you're effectively getting is a sort of a skeleton of Irish without any flesh on it. You're getting what we would have called Dublin Irish or Béarlachas, which is a sort of a semi-transliteration from English with bits of Irish thrown in. But the nation is not living through Irish, and therefore the vocabulary and the richness and all of that you would have had in the agricultural setting in the old days is not being developed in a natural way and being used by people. And that's my own feeling. It's just a gut feeling that I have about the thing. Thanks.
Okay, do we have other questions anyone would like to ask? Nadia?
Yeah. Hi, thank you very much for this fantastic presentation and for opportunity to ask. My question would be, I'm not quite sure, maybe you said that, maybe I missed that. So what is your take about what was driving the change for the policy for De Valera throughout this time? That if you're saying that he was doubling down, but I mean he has had impact on the language policy for a very long time. And what was the big driver for this change from state to public responsibility? Thanks.
Yeah, really good question. I think it was, I mentioned there. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Maybe,
Yeah.
do you mind muting your mic, please? Thanks. Yep, there was just an echo there. Yeah, I think from 1922 until 1937, you see this steady trajectory of progress. And then maybe similar to going back to Paul's question or Paul's point there, De Valera may have recognized then that, and it seems to be the case, that by 1937 and with the new constitution, which clarified the status of Irish within the state and all the measures that had been put in place, it might have looked like, okay, we have reached the point here of where the state has now done its duty in relation to the language. We've done everything we can, and there has to be another phase, a new phase of the revival in which the public have to accept more responsibility. But I'd be critical of the fact that the state has often, predominantly been, I would argue, deliberately vague in the fact that people, like that, the photograph I showed you from 1913, that the generation, and I'd imagine most of the Irish public for these in the early 20th century understood that the state had the goal of reviving Irish to be the predominant language in the country. But this was very rarely written down, or especially in something like a constitution. So the lack of goals and the lack of clarity creates, I would say, confusion. So there wasn't the announcement of a new policy or a new era of the revival in the early 1940s. You have to really go and look for it in De Valera's speeches, and you see this theme suddenly becomes prevalent from the late 1930s, that it's up to the public to do more. Obviously, like I said, there has to be a relationship between the state and the public. The state can't. We know the state can't revive a language on its own. You need public support. Interesting in the Irish context that there was, and there remains massive public support for the revival of Irish. I've seen the analogy somewhere that if most Irish people were offered a pill and told, a superpower pill, and told you could speak Irish after you take this pill, most people would take it. But again, back to the previous person who asked the question there, Paul, it takes a lot of time to learn a language or become good at a musical instrument, and especially if there's not clear motivation for it, economic motivation or otherwise, it can be really difficult for people to get motivated to do these things themselves. And then you're going back in this continuous kind of circle, because then you're going back to, well, there's a responsibility on the state to reflect the interests and the attitudes of the public it represents, and they should incentivize. I went a bit away from your question there, sorry.
Okay. Thanks, Nadia. Let's move on to Sean.
Thanks, Peter. I'm going back to the points that Paul O'Dwyer raised about motivation. Surely we need to sort of disaggregate the public we're talking about and look at different groups. Now, my impression is that, growing up in Dublin in the 1960s, is that marked a sort of a major change in the sort of people you saw on the radio or heard on the radio or saw on television advocating Irish language causes. That up to then, it had been mainly a Gaeltacht-based interest group, pushing the interests of the Gaeltacht. Now you're getting much more urban middle-class advocates for language revival. And that will be linked to, you know, the same forces that have driven the rise of identity politics everywhere in the Western world. Concern over globalization, the sense of very rapid social change, leaving people unsure who they are. And then, of course, the proliferation of Irish language schools in Dublin, like the proliferation of faith schools in the UK, linked as well to concern about lower standards in the public schools. And then, of course, with immigration, there's the famous comment that people send their kids to an Irish language school in Dublin now to go to a school where the main language is English. There's a lot of complexities there. So with all that in mind, the Irish language organisations that De Valera is dealing with in the 30s and 40s, I mean, who are they? Are they survivors of the revolutionary generation, still pushing those ideals? Are they a younger generation? Are they a Gaeltacht-based interest group? Or do they represent areas outside the Gaeltacht committed to revival?
Yeah, good question. I wonder, I'm not sure if you can still see my slides. It doesn't matter, actually. I was going to go back, but the 1930s, so there was nothing really for the first 10 years of the state. We've seen the decline of the League, and people seemed happy enough, Irish speakers seemed happy enough to wait and see and leave it up to the state to see what it would do. And then it's the early 1930s, we see the first growth in the number of organizations. They were primarily fall into one of two categories. They pretty much, there was groups that broke away from the Gaelic League, and these tended to be younger university students really, and socialists or university students with a left-wing agenda who viewed the League as too old-fashioned. And then the League had never had very good representation or kind of presence within the Gaeltacht or within Irish-speaking areas up until that point. Because I suppose the League was something, the point of the League, in short, was to teach Irish or to provide opportunities for people to learn Irish. So you can understand then why it wasn't particularly present in the Gaeltacht. So then in that's the early 1930s, you see good support for Fianna Fáil in the Gaeltacht, and then you see Fianna Fáil coming to power, and you see Irish speakers in the Gaeltacht, particularly Connemara then in 1933, 1934, looking around themselves and saying nothing's changed. Martin O'Kane and others in a publicity stunt in 1934 cycled overnight from Connemara to Dublin to stand outside De Valera's office, and they were granted, 6 of them were granted a private meeting, and that's what led to the innovative and experimental land redistribution scheme in County Meath, which I was going to talk about as part of this as well, but tried to keep it more brief. In the 1940s then, so those organizations that emerged in the early 1930s then, they're either Gaeltacht or kind of young university. Then early 1940s, you see a lot more groups emerging, and it was a lot more diverse too. You have a number of really successful in terms of the Irish language, really well-known publications, you know, the Core, FASTA, INU, whether they're newspapers or monthly journals or publications. So that there was the development of a more visible print, or I don't know what you would call journalism, kind of available for Irish speakers, and these tended to be mostly younger, similar to how De Valera was advocating for a new youth organisation and placing the emphasis on the young. The public were doing the same thing, because these new organisations tended to be led by younger factions. Politics of the 1930s and 40s, I suppose, played a part too. I mentioned that there was a lot of socialists in these groups in the early 30s. And in the early 1940s, there were one or two organisations set up that were essentially fascist. I don't know if you're familiar with Altieri and the Hash area, which firstly kind of has its origins as breaking off as a part of as a branch of the Gaelic League, and but similar themes to what De Valera was talking about, viewed the revival as dependent on the young. To get back to the start of your question there, Sean, that's the state tied the revival primarily with education, for better or worse, and probably mostly for worse. And despite the likes of De Valera and that generation, despite their recognition of the importance of the Gaeltacht, even in terms of molding their own interest in the language and passion whenever they started learning it, they really, the biggest criticism you have to make of this generation of Cumann O'Neill and Fianna Fáil is their disregard for the Gaeltacht, essentially. And you're really looking at, the state was established for 50 or 60 years before you have the likes of, so you have the department for the Gaeltacht established in 56, and Gaeltara Éireann was set up as a statutory body to attract and encourage investment and economic development of the Gaeltacht. But the 70s and the 80s saw Údarás na Gaeltachta was 1980, I think, that was set up, and that's still going today. And Radio na Gaeltachta was actually, it was set up in 1973, I think, the radio station. And even then, it was only set up in response to direct pressure coming from, I think it was in Connemara, that a pirate radio station was set up, and they were petitioning the government. So like even in the 70s, then the state, if I can lump all the politicians together and successive governments of different parties, in terms of language planning, they still hadn't realised the importance of the Gaeltacht, and that you couldn't revive the language through the education system, because as we know, it wasn't as effective as they would have originally hoped.
Okay, thanks, Sean. We have time for one or two more questions. Micheál?
Thanks very much, Peter. I enjoyed that, Padraig. Could have made a good. I was very struck by one of your opening slides, and one very near the top anyway, where you talked in terms of some of the commentators on De Valera and his support of the Irish language. This word sincere was repeatedly mentioned. It was very striking. And then later on at another point, you referred to De Valera himself asking Fianna Fáil, and if you like, questioning Fianna Fáil in terms of sincerity policy. So would you say that De Valera was an increasingly frustrated Irish speaker with the passage of time?
Really good question. You're right. I think whenever he made the comment about sincerity to Fianna Fáil Ardesh in 1930, he would have viewed, I don't think he would have been worried at that stage, because I think he would have been confident, and I mean, looking back, you would expect that he was planning on great things in terms of the Irish language, amongst other areas, whenever he came to power. Ní mar sin a Harla, Vedger. I think there's definitely a divergence, or there's a completely, I would completely agree that there's a conflict between De Valera the individual, or De Valera the Irish speaker, with this intense, personal, sincere passion and interest in the Irish language, and then there's De Valera, the head of government for decades and president. I think it's Joe Lee in a couple of works comments on the fact, the frustration of De Valera, or De Valera's inability to even get his own cabinet to speak Irish. I suppose, as you know, Micheál, I'm primarily looking at De Valera's relationship with the Irish language and all things Irish language, but I always have to remind myself that there's a much wider context here, and it's especially whenever you're looking at he seemed to suddenly give up on this idea of establishing a youth organisation in the end of 1939, 1940. It just fell off his radar, and he never mentioned it again after 1940. I wonder why, because he was busy. There was a lot going on beyond just the Irish language. So in terms of frustration, though, it's hard to know how, like, this transition, I would say, in his speeches, the increased emphasis on public responsibility, it's hard to know you have to get inside the mind of the person, I suppose, to know, did De Valera genuinely believe that, or was that a defense mechanism, thinking, I've done, and my party has done, and the state has done all we can kind of here without losing face. So the next stage is I just have to keep my head down and keep emphasizing public responsibility. But there's certainly evidence of frustrations within cabinet and within government, like, of inability to get even his own cabinet to speak Irish. So frustrated, I would say, definitely. And by the 1960s, whenever De Valera was recording a lot of his recollections and memoirs for posterity, he frequently pointed out that the Irish language was his failure to revive the Irish language more effectively was his greatest regret, and the thing that he was saddest about, essentially. I have a lot of, whenever you see some of the way he talked and wrote about language too, I definitely sympathize with them. I think any Irish speaker would be interested in it, and it's an interesting topic.
Thank you very much. Good meal, Michael. Thank you.
Thanks, Micheál. We may be time for one last question, if someone is desperate to ask one. Do you have a final question? No, I don't think we do. So falls to me then to thank Padraig again for giving us such a stimulating and fascinating paper, setting out the core of his research on De Valera and the language question. So Padraig, thank you very much. Perhaps I could just ask everyone to briefly unmute themselves and give Padraig a normal round of applause for his contribution. So it just falls to me before everyone goes just to thank you all for participating. And to remind you, we do have a seminar next week, 4:30. We've Emer Nolan from Maynooth speaking on second wave feminism and the relationship between nationalism and feminism in Ireland in the 1970s. So as usual, I'll set up an Eventbrite and we'll let you know the details of that through our normal ways and means. So if you can, please join us next week for that seminar. But for today, thank you very much and good evening.
Thanks, Peter.